Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Marcus Sterling called her, every time he passed, voice thin as a scalpel, eyes sliding past her like she was equipment that needed replacing. He'd been saying it for 8 months, and he meant it as a diagnosis. Terminal mediocrity. The kind of person who clocked in, clocked out, and left no mark. Laura Bennett heard it every time. She never looked up from whatever she was doing. Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah breathes like a living thing at 6:56 a.m., fluorescent lights humming their electric monotone, coffee machines gurgling in the break room, the distant wheeze of ventilators behind closed patient doors. The ER hasn't woken up yet. The day shift is still pulling on their badges, checking their phones, preparing their masks for the chaos that will come. It always comes. Laura knows this rhythm the way a musician knows a song played 10,000 times. Her hands move through it without thought. Muscle memory. Except muscle memory implies the body remembers what it once was, and she'd spent the last 8 months trying very hard to forget. The supply closet in Trauma Bay 2 is small, windowless, lined floor to ceiling with plastic bins labeled in permanent marker. Gauze. Airway supplies. For catheters in ascending gauges, 18, 20, 22. Sutures. The organizational logic is hospital standard, alphabetical, color-coded, arranged for speed. Laura had reorganized it twice in her first week because the previous system made no sense. The nurse manager had noticed. The other nurses had noticed. Dr. Sterling had noticed. None of them mentioned it because noticing would require acknowledging her competence, and competence was not the narrative he'd established. She restocks the 14-gauge angiocath needles now, her movements efficient and precise. One box of 50 placed on the shelf, rotated forward so the oldest supply comes out first. The next box positioned directly behind. The plastic crinkles softly as she works. Around her wrists, visible because her scrubs are pushed up past her elbows, rope burns circle her skin in faded white lines. They're old, 6 years old, maybe 7, marks from carrying stretchers through desert heat, from gripping equipment during medevac runs, from the specific kind of labor that leaves its signature on bone. The scars have faded to the color of old paper, nearly invisible unless the light catches them just right. Most people don't notice. The ones who do don't ask. Laura's hands don't shake. They haven't shaken in a long time, and she intends to keep it that way. The left hand sometimes wants to. There's a tremor that starts deep in her forearm when sirens wail close to the hospital, when a stretcher rolls in with blood already soaking through the first layer of gauze, when a monitor flatlines somewhere down the corridor and she hears the code called over the intercom. But she's learned to manage it. Breathing. Stillness. The kind of stillness that comes from having already survived the worst that mortality can offer. She finishes the angiocaths and moves to the Foley catheters, her badge clipping the metal shelving with a soft clink as she reaches. The badge reads, L. Bennett, RN, nursing license number for 7829, start date 8 months prior. 8 months to the day, actually. The higher date was deliberate. Savannah was far enough from everywhere that mattered. The job was anonymous. The hospital was large enough that she could be invisible if she worked at it, and she had worked at it with the same focused intensity she'd once applied to combat medicine. Blend in. Don't stand out. Don't give anyone a reason to look closer. Don't let anyone near enough to ask the wrong questions. This was the plan. This was the life she'd chosen when she walked away from the other life, the one where her name meant something, where people recognized the call sign, where the Viper could clear a room just by walking through the door. Now Viper restocked supplies in an ER in Georgia and nobody knew her name. The ER itself was beginning to stir. At 7:15 a.m., the day shift nurses arrived in clusters, laughing about something on their phones, complaining about traffic on IR-95, checking the assignment board to see who'd gotten the good assignments and who'd gotten the disasters. Laura watched from inside the supply closet, the door half closed, and noted the dynamics the way she'd once noted the positioning of insurgents in Marja. Stephanie and Jennifer were tight, they'd work together if they could. Marcus rotated between team leaders depending on whoever was nicest to him that morning. Keisha didn't care who she worked with, she was competent enough to handle anything. The new girl, Chloe, was still learning the system. She'd make a good nurse in 2 years. She was already asking the right questions. Laura stepped out of the supply closet with an armful of restock bins and began arranging the trauma bay in the specific sequence she'd learned through repetition and observation. Gloves at hand height. Airway supplies on the top shelf, within arm's reach of a 6-foot doctor. Medications organized by frequency of use, not by classification. The defibrillator pads in the crash kit already checked. She verified the expiration date every morning because that was the kind of thing that got people killed. 1 second of delay looking for the right equipment, 1 moment of fumbling, and someone died. She'd lived with that knowledge long enough to respect it completely. The work was methodical. Meditative. It didn't require thought, which meant it left her mind free to do what she'd been trying to prevent for 8 months, remember. The smell of the supply closet carried hints of antiseptic and the slightly sweet chemical scent of sterile packaging. It was nothing like the smell she remembered, but her brain didn't care about accuracy. Amygdala doesn't distinguish between actual threat and triggered memory. It just fires. She pulled her sleeves down over her wrists because seeing the scars made it worse. That's when Dr. Sterling arrived. He entered the ER like he was entering a conference room he owned. 6 feet tall, designer watch that cost more than Laura's monthly rent, tie that had probably been tied by someone who worked in a haberdashery, a real shop, not a department store. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a shine that reflected the fluorescent lights. He moved through the ER the way predators move through territory, acknowledging the landscape not out of respect but out of idle curiosity about what belonged to him. His eyes passed across the nurses with the same expression he probably used when reviewing hospital inventory. Then he saw Laura. She was standing in Trauma Bay 2, arranging suture kits by size in ascending order, 4.0 pediatric, 3.0, 2.0. Her hands moved with unusual speed, not rushed, but efficient in a way that suggested deep familiarity with the task. The kind of familiarity that came from having done it thousands of times, from having developed an instinctive relationship with the equipment itself. Her hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her scrubs were plain blue, and her face showed the particular expression of someone performing a task that required precision but not emotion. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened. He'd been watching Laura Bennett for 8 months the way a man watches a piece of furniture that doesn't match his aesthetic. She was competent in a way that was quietly insubordinate, not openly defiant, but quietly thorough in a manner that suggested she understood the work on a level he did not. 2 weeks ago, she'd corrected a billing code on a patient chart, flagging what she described as a discrepancy in the procedure documentation. Sterling had written it off as a clerical error when the billing manager asked about it, but the look in Laura's eyes when she'd done it, that flat, knowing gaze, had suggested she was questioning his accuracy. His competence. His authority. She'd done it again last week with a different patient, the same polite notation in the chart, procedure code may not align with clinical documentation. Not accusatory. Not direct. Just thorough. The kind of thorough that could become a problem if she kept it up long enough. Sterling made a mental note as he walked past. 8 months was long enough. The woman was competent enough to be dangerous and underqualified enough that he could dismantle her without resistance. She had no connections at Sacred Heart, no allies among the attending physicians, no one who'd advocate if he decided she wasn't working out. Better to eliminate the problem now before it grew into something that required actual attention. A quiet word here, a shift reassignment there, maybe a public correction in front of her peers. Most nurses broke under that kind of pressure. Most people did. The ones who didn't were usually the ones with something to prove, and this one clearly wasn't interested in proving anything to anyone. She just worked. Quietly. Thoroughly. Completely invisible. Except she wasn't invisible. That was the problem. Not invisible like someone nobody noticed, invisible like someone everyone deliberately chose not to see. There was a difference, and Sterling could never quite explain why the difference bothered him so much. Maybe it was because the second kind of invisible usually meant the person had decided not to care what anyone thought. And people who didn't care were dangerous. People who didn't care were the ones who ended up creating problems. He passed by without stopping, his footsteps echoing on the tile floor, and Laura didn't look up from her work. She simply continued arranging suture kits, her hand steady, her face composed, her entire presence suggesting she'd never even noticed he was there. Which meant she had definitely noticed he was there, and was choosing not to react. Which meant she was the kind of woman who understood hierarchy well enough to know when to defy it with absolute silence. The ER was beginning to fill now. The day shift nurses were reviewing assignments. The first ambulance of the morning was probably already rolling toward the hospital, the dispatcher's voice crackling over radio somewhere in the Savannah streets. Monitors started beeping as morning vitals were checked on the patients who'd stayed overnight. The coffee machine gurgled louder. Someone dropped a metal instrument tray in one of the other trauma bays, and the sound echoed like a bell through the corridor. Laura finished organizing the suture kits, verified the inventory on the defibrillator pads one final time, and stepped back to survey her work. Everything was in place. Everything was ready. She had no idea that the man in the Italian leather shoes had just decided her employment at Sacred Heart was temporary. She had no idea that he'd already begun constructing the narrative in his mind, how to describe her as incompetent, how to isolate her from the other staff, how to make it clear that she didn't belong here. What she did know, with a kind of certainty that came from training and instinct, was that the quiet man in the designer tie had looked at her with the specific contempt reserved for people he'd decided were problems. She'd seen that look before, in different contexts, directed at people who'd made the fatal mistake of noticing things they weren't supposed to notice. The look that meant he was already planning. Already strategizing. Already believing himself to be 10 steps ahead. She'd learned long ago that men like that were rarely 10 steps ahead of anything. They were usually so convinced of their own intelligence that they failed to notice when someone smarter was simply playing a longer game. But she wouldn't play any game at all if she could help it. All she wanted was to work, stay invisible, and survive the next year until she could move on to another city, another hospital, another attempt to become someone who'd never carried a weapon or made decisions that cost lives. The 7:22 a.m. code came over the intercom, like it always did. Laura's left hand tremored for exactly 1 second, the unconscious physiological response to the sound of urgency, and then she breathed, and it stopped. She pulled her sleeves down over her wrists and walked toward the ambulance bay, where the real work was about to begin. The lunch rush hit Sacred Heart's cafeteria like an incoming tide, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the clatter of trays, voices layering into white noise. Laura sat alone at a corner table, surgical mask still hanging around her neck from the morning trauma cases, when Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the din like a scalpel finding target tissue. $20, he announced to the two residents flanking him, Dr. Chen and Dr. Kapoor, both laughing before he even finished the sentence. $20 says Mouse quits by Friday. She doesn't have the spine for real medicine. The laughter rippled outward. Laura kept her eyes on her soup. Clam chowder from the cafeteria line, overcooked as always, but she ate it anyway because stopping to care about taste was a luxury she'd learned to abandon in places where meals came from field rations and the water tasted like diesel. Her hands remained steady on her spoon. The tremor that tried to surface, pure autonomic nervous system, the same response that had once made her fingers precise during combat triage, she locked it down with a single measured breath. Dr. Sterling stood 5 feet away. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressively masculine, the kind of fragrance designed to announce authority before the man himself did. He was watching her, waiting for a reaction. Laura gave him nothing. She took another spoonful of soup. He moved closer. The timing was practiced, the physicality precisely casual. His elbow swept out as if he were gesturing mid-conversation, and Laura's entire lunch tray, soup bowl, crackers, plastic cup of water, scattered across the tile floor in a detonation of sound and spillage. The clam chowder spread like a pale stain across the white floor tiles, creeping toward the table legs. The cafeteria went very quiet. Everyone was watching now. She could feel the weight of 30, 40 pairs of eyes. Nurses on their 15-minute breaks. Orderlies killing time between patient transfers. A chaplain from the 5th floor. The room went so quiet you could hear the refrigerators humming in the kitchen behind the service counter. Laura closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Just one. Then she opened them, stood, and walked to the maintenance closet for paper towels and a mop. Her movements were economical, purposeful, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. As she passed Dr. Sterling, he was watching her with an expression she recognized immediately, contempt mixed with satisfaction. He'd expected tears. Expected her to crumble. Expected the performance of wounded dignity that would validate his superiority. She gave him neither. By the time she returned with the mop and paper towels, the cafeteria had resumed its noise, conversations restarting like a film reel, the moment already sliding into gossip and speculation. Laura cleaned methodically, knelt on the tile, absorbed the mess into industrial paper towels. A single tear escaped unbidden, tracking down her left cheekbone, her body's physiological response to adrenaline and controlled rage, nothing more, but she wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact when Sterling smirked down at her one final time before walking away. She would not give him the satisfaction of looking away first. 2 days later, Dr. Sterling found her in the medical records section of the ER, cross-referencing chart notes with medication administration records, the meticulous charting habit that had kept 17 people alive in Marja and now kept her employed and invisible in Savannah. For nurses were working nearby, 2 orderlies moving equipment through the adjacent hallway. Witnesses. He wanted witnesses. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, and a patient chart landed at her feet with a sharp slap against the tile. His voice was loud enough to carry, dripping with condescension the way oil floats across water. "Unless you need me to draw you a diagram." Laura crouched slowly. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from 100 similar moments, retrieving supplies under fire, bending for medications while mortars impacted a click away, the body learning to continue functioning while the mind compartmentalized fear into a locked box. She picked up the chart. The pages were still warm from his hands. She straightened. And then she looked directly into his eyes. "I've picked up pieces of people in the desert, doctor," she said. Her voice dropped an octave, not anger, not defensiveness, just the flat declarative tone of someone stating observable fact. "A clipboard doesn't scare me." His smile faltered. Not disappeared, faltered. A half-second of genuine uncertainty crossed his face before he turned away and walked back toward the attending physician station, his stride less confident than it had been 30 seconds earlier. The nurses pretended they hadn't heard anything. The orderlies suddenly became very focused on their equipment. Laura didn't move for 3 seconds. Then she filed the chart in its proper slot with the precision of someone placing a critical medical device, and returned to the medication record she'd been reviewing. But that wasn't the worst part. That evening, locked in the privacy of her assigned locker on the 2nd floor, Laura reviewed the same charts she always reviewed, the ones that had caught her attention because the documentation didn't match standard protocols. 2 more irregularities in Dr. Sterling's surgical cases. Procedure codes that implied complex interventions, an arthroscopic repair listed as performed, the full surgical package code billed at $47,000, except the anesthesia record showed a patient who was in and out in 14 minutes. Not enough time for the procedure described. Not remotely enough time. A coronary bypass listed as performed. The cardiac catheterization films didn't show any surgical access. The patient had received an angiogram and pharmaceutical management. Insurance fraud isn't always loud. Usually it's quiet, a line item here, a code there, the accumulation of false claims that added up to 6 figures annually if you knew where to look. Laura corrected the records in the system, assuming honest mistakes. Assuming a physician who'd grown lazy or careless, whose documentation habits had deteriorated over years of overconfidence. She made the correction silently, with no note to Dr. Sterling, no flagging of discrepancies. She didn't understand yet that she'd just made herself into something worse than invisible. She'd made herself a witness to a crime that would have paid for Sterling's vacation home in Hilton Head and his wife's new Range Rover. She didn't understand yet that correcting his fraudulent billing was the same as pointing a gun at his career. Laura drove home that night with the windows down, the humid Savannah air thick as bathwater against her skin. She sat in her apartment for 2 hours without turning on the lights, just watching the street below, her hands flat on her thighs. The tremor came in her forearms around midnight, delayed stress response, the body catching up to what the mind had learned to process years ago. She pressed her palms against her thighs and breathed through it. 3 weeks later, the John Doe arrived. Warehouse accident, the radio call said. Arterial bleed in the left thigh, trauma Bay 3. The patient was conscious, lucid, bleeding out at a rate that meant they had maybe 7 minutes before he became a body instead of a person. Laura was scrubbing in when Dr. Patel gave the orders, fluid resuscitation, type O negative, and get him prepped for vascular repair. No time for general anesthesia. Local would have to suffice. She was placing sutures, 4.0 nylon, specific 3-layer closure technique that most civilian surgeons didn't know existed, when the patient's eyes snapped open beneath the surgical drape. Dilated but focused. Present. His right hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with the kind of strength that came from muscle memory and instinct, from hands that had gripped rifles and rappel lines and the shoulders of soldiers who needed steadying. He stared at her suture work. "You were a combat medic," he whispered. Not a question. A recognition. The same way a soldier recognizes another soldier by posture, by the specific way of moving through space, by the invisible marks that deployments leave on a person's nervous system. Laura's hands froze for 2 seconds, the longest pause of her nursing career, the first time in 8 months that her discipline had cracked even slightly. Then she completed the stitch without acknowledging his words. Dr. Patel was focused on hemostasis, didn't notice the exchange, didn't notice the way the patient's pupils dilated further as he stared at her face, trying to place her, trying to match the nurse above him with some unit he'd served in, some deployment, some memory from when he'd been something other than a construction foreman bleeding out on a trauma table. Sedation pulled him under 2 minutes later. That night, Laura drove to the Savannah VA hospital for the appointment marked in her phone calendar as a therapy, the one she'd made 3 months ago and kept pushing back. The waiting room was full of veterans. Younger ones mostly, men in their 20s and 30s wearing the 1,000-yard stare she recognized from reflections in her bathroom mirror. One was missing his right leg below the knee. Another had scars that suggested IED fragmentation from the left side of his face. A third was simply staring at nothing, his hand shaking at a frequency that suggested combat PTSD hadn't released its grip. She'd treated men like them in field hospitals. Kept them alive long enough to reach proper medical care. Held their hands while medevacs came in. Picked up pieces of people in the desert, just like she'd told Dr. Sterling. A nurse called her name. "Miss Bennett?" "Laura Bennett." She didn't move. The nurse called again. Laura stood slowly and walked toward the counseling office, wondering if she'd ever be able to stop running from herself, wondering how many lifetimes she'd need to spend in quiet rooms doing quiet jobs before the weight of what she'd seen in Marja would finally release its grip on her chest. The hallway stretched ahead of her, fluorescent lights humming like a heartbeat, and she kept walking toward the door marked counselor with the same steady pace she'd used to clean up spilled soup in the Sacred Heart cafeteria. The John Doe arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after the chart incident, tagged as a warehouse accident victim with a thigh laceration. Laura processed the intake paperwork, no ID, no insurance card, no emergency contact, and barely looked up from her tablet as the orderlies wheeled him past the nurse's station. Dr. Patel was already prepping the surgical bay, muttering about arterial bleeding and the need for vascular surgery, when the patient's vitals flagged, blood pressure dropping like a stone, oxygen saturation sliding toward dangerous. The monitors screamed their digital alarm, a sound like a dentist's drill cutting through bone, and Laura moved before anyone gave an order. She'd learned this in Marja, in a field hospital where the walls shook with mortar fire and the triage was not a suggestion but a prayer: know your patient before you touch them. She read his chart at a glance, left thigh laceration, possible femoral artery involvement, and prepared the surgical suite with the precision of muscle memory. Sterile field. Instruments laid out in the exact sequence they'd need them. For access already running cold saline through a 16-gauge line. The attending was thorough, methodical, the kind of surgeon who trusted his hands more than his instinct, and when he glanced at Laura across the surgical field, she was already there, needle poised, suture material looped in practiced loops. The local anesthesia kept the patient conscious enough to feel the surgery but not conscious enough to scream. His eyes were glassy, focused somewhere between pain and confusion, when Laura began the repair. This was not routine work. The femoral artery was severed clean, the kind of injury that killed people in 6 minutes without intervention, and the vessel itself was delicate as a whisper, fragile as something that had survived only by luck. She began the 3-layer closure, intimal, medial, adventitial, each suture placed with the kind of precision that took years to perfect and seconds to mess up completely. Her hands moved with the kind of certainty that made Dr. Patel stop mid-instruction and simply watch. The needle went in. The stitch caught. The pattern repeated, a rhythm like a heartbeat, like breathing, like the muscle memory of 847 combat casualties who'd survived because someone's hands knew exactly what to do. The John Doe's eyes snapped open beneath the local anesthesia. Not the sluggish awareness of sedation but alert clarity, the kind of focus that comes from recognizing something that should be impossible. His pupils tracked the needle's path, followed the precise angle of the suture, studied the exact spacing between stitches. Laura felt his gaze before she looked up, and when she did, his right hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with the strength of someone who'd just escaped death and knew exactly what had saved him. His voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper through dry lips. "You were a combat medic." It wasn't a question. It was identification, the way a sniper recognizes another sniper from a single scope adjustment, the way soldiers recognize their own kind in a room full of civilians. Laura didn't flinch. She didn't pull her wrist away. The needle remained suspended between her fingers, and she continued the closure without breaking rhythm, without acknowledging the words, without confirming or denying anything. Dr. Patel's hands froze mid-reach for the next instrument. The surgical nurses exchanged glances that flickered with confusion. The heart monitor beeped its steady 4-beat pattern, and Laura tied off the final knot with the same deliberate care she'd used for the first. She was halfway through the adventitial layer when the John Doe's grip loosened. She didn't look at his face. She'd learned a long time ago that seeing someone recognize you was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she focused on the work, on the blood that needed to stay inside his body, on the fact that his femoral artery would function again because someone in this room understood exactly how to make that happen. The closure was flawless. Dr. Patel completed the wound repair, and 20 minutes later, the patient was being transferred to ICU with a bleeding rate that would hold and a prognosis that looked like survival instead of a body bag. Laura stripped off her gloves in the hallway outside the surgical bay. The latex made the distinctive snapping sound, rubber meeting air with a sharp crack, and she disposed of them in the hazmat bin with the same methodical care she'd used for the sutures. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electronic drone above her head, a sound she'd stopped hearing years ago but now seemed impossibly loud, impossibly aware. She could feel Sterling watching her even before she looked up from the sharp's disposal and saw him standing 30 feet away, phone already to his ear, his eyes tracking her like a hawk marking prey from a thermal updraft. He was calling someone. Not a colleague. Not a consult. His voice was low, urgent, the tone of a man making a decision that couldn't be unmade. Laura saw the calculation happen behind his eyes, the moment he understood that she hadn't just assisted on a routine arterial repair. She'd performed a closure technique that shouldn't exist in civilian medical training, that shouldn't be in her hands, that proved something he'd started suspecting 8 months ago. She watched him hang up, wait exactly 10 seconds, and dial again. His second call lasted 45 seconds. His third call lasted 90. By the time he ended the conversation, Laura knew her tenure at Sacred Heart Hospital was measured in hours, not weeks. She returned to her regular duties because leaving early would signal panic, and Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett didn't panic. She restocked the trauma bay. She processed patient charts. She responded to call lights with the same composed efficiency she'd used since day one. But everything felt borrowed now, temporary, the way a safe house feels when you're watching the door for someone who shouldn't be able to find you. She could hear Sterling's movements throughout the afternoon, his office phone ringing, his door opening and closing, his voice in conversations that were clearly about her, all conducted at the distance and volume of someone confident in his institutional power. She'd learned this too, in a different context, when authority decided you were expendable. The speed of your removal depended only on how thoroughly they could construct the paperwork. By her next shift, the restrictions had begun. Sterling reassigned her from the trauma bay rotation, moved her to a desk role processing admissions. It wasn't a suspension. It was a slow suffocation, a reduction of responsibility so gradual that no single moment could be defined as retaliation. The trauma cases went to other nurses. The emergency calls that used to come through to her went to the ICU team instead. She found herself in a clerical office, fluorescent lights flickering like a bad transmission, processing paperwork for patients she'd never see, in a hospital where she'd spent 8 months learning the unspoken rule that invisible people stayed invisible longest. The irony was bitter and sharp. Sterling was right. She was a problem that needed to be eliminated. But not because she was a threat to the hospital. She was a threat to him, and he was eliminating her the way power always eliminated threats, quietly, methodically, through the very systems that were supposed to protect patients instead of protect criminals. She knew that her meticulous charting had caught at least 2 discrepancies in his billing patterns. She knew that his insurance fraud was running into thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, and that her continued presence, her obsessive attention to detail, her inability to ignore suspicious patterns, was a liability he could no longer afford. What happened next would change everything. 2 weeks. That's all the margin Sterling had left before the machinery he'd built for 17 years started showing its first visible cracks. The IR-95 pileup came at 4:13 p.m. on a Thursday, dispatch crackling across Sacred Heart's trauma channels like static before a storm, 12-vehicle collision, mile marker 127, multiple critical injuries, ETA 8 minutes. Laura heard it from the supply closet where she was restocking chest tube kits, and her hands moved without thinking, muscle memory older than her civilian life, older than Savannah, older than the careful fiction of being unremarkable. She was already moving toward the ER before the overhead alert finished sounding. The emergency department erupted the way it always did, but this time different, not panic, but the controlled chaos of a facility suddenly confronted with what it was built to survive. Trauma Bay 1 through 4 spun into motion, sheets stripped and replaced, monitors powered up, crash carts positioned like soldiers awaiting orders. Dr. James Chen, the attending trauma surgeon, moved with the economical precision of a man who'd seen worse, delegating bed assignments and calling for blood bank to have O-negative typed and crossed. Residents scrambled. Nurses prepped for lines and gathered equipment. Laura coordinated it without raising her voice, directing traffic with the casual authority of someone who'd orchestrated medical triage under mortar fire. A young resident named Marcus nearly collided with her at the doorway to Trauma Bay 3. She sidestepped. He didn't even notice. That was the thing about being invisible, you could move through a room like water, efficient and unremarkable. The ambulances pulled in at 5:03 p.m. First arrival, a sedan driver with crush injuries to the lower extremities, conscious but shocky, bleeding out slowly from compound fractures. Second, a pickup truck passenger with facial trauma and a pneumothorax that required chest decompression before they even got him to the bay. Third, fourth, fifth in rapid succession, the inventory of human damage that highway speeds could produce. Laura watched the controlled chaos from the corridor, hand steady, mind already 3 steps ahead of each crisis. She'd stopped trying to be just a nurse somewhere around her 3rd deployment. It never stuck. But the 7th ambulance brought something different. The doors burst open and she heard him before she saw him, a roar that sounded like an animal, raw and desperate and carrying the particular anguish of a man who'd found his world collapsing in real time. 7 feet of construction worker, thick across the shoulders and running on pure adrenaline, carrying his foreman like a child carries a broken toy. The foreman's head lolled backward. Blood frothed from his lips. His skin had gone the grey-white color that told Laura everything about the pressure building inside his chest cavity. Cardiac tamponade. The blood that should stay inside the heart was filling the pericardial sac, crushing the chambers, choking off the organ's ability to pump. Without intervention in the next 2 minutes, his heart would stop entirely. Every staff member in the ER froze. The massive man was shouting, incoherent, terrified, dangerous, and the primitive brain's response was to retreat. A resident stepped backward. A nurse moved away from the doorway. Even Dr. Chen hesitated, something flickering across his face that looked like the calculation of whether this situation had a resolution or just an expiration date. The construction worker was wild-eyed and covered in his friend's blood, a walking catastrophe that made the conventional staff's nervous system scream danger. Laura walked toward him. Not ran. Walked. The same stride she'd used in Marja when rounds came in from the south and everyone else was taking cover, the stride that communicated one thing: the crisis is manageable, and I am already solving it. She moved through the air like someone unafraid of what it contained, like she'd moved through worse storms than a terrified man and his dying friend. His name, she said. Not a question. The man blinked at her, the question cutting through the noise in his head like a blade through water. His name is Jake. Jake Mercer. Please. He can't, he's not, the words came fractured and desperate. I have him, Laura said, and she extended her hands with the absolute certainty of someone who'd held worse things together. The construction worker hesitated for one breath, just one, and then he released the burden. 70 pounds of dying man transferred from his shaking arms into hers like a prayer being answered. Laura moved. The ER staff parted like a current around a stone. She had Jake on the trauma bay table in 4 seconds, chest exposed, heart monitor placed, the sound of the monitor finding his rhythm, erratic, weakening, each beat slower than the last. His oxygen saturation was 74 and dropping. His blood pressure was a ghost of what it had been. He had seconds left, maybe a minute if she was generous with the physics of a system shutting down. She didn't reach for the ultrasound. Didn't wait for the attending. The 14-gauge needle was in her hand already, the procedural muscle memory of 400 field decompression procedures, the hands of someone who'd learned to make these decisions while other people were still learning to use stethoscopes properly. She located the fourth intercostal space, mid-axillary line, and pushed through the skin with the fluid precision of a machine designed for exactly this one purpose. The needle advanced. She felt it, that specific resistance that meant she was penetrating the pericardial sac, that thin membrane holding the blood that was killing him. Then the give. The hiss of air escaping. The syringe attached to the needle began filling with dark blood, each milliliter representing pressure releasing, chambers expanding, a heart getting permission to beat again. Oxygen sat rising, 74 to 81 to 88 to 92. Systolic pressure climbing, 62 to 79 to 94 to 107. Heart rate steadying from the panicked 138 to something almost approaching rhythm. Jake Mercer's eyes fluttered open. His breathing deepened. The grey-white color began retreating from his skin like a tide running back out. Dr. Chen stood 4 feet away, watching. His expression had shifted from calculation to something that looked like witnessing. He knew what he'd just seen. So did every staff member in the bay. The procedure had been performed by someone whose hands moved like they'd done this 400 times, not 0 times as a civilian nurse in Savannah, Georgia should be capable of doing. Laura secured the needle with tape and stepped back. Her gloved hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. She turned to Dr. Chen without meeting his eyes and said only, "He'll need cardiothoracic consult and likely surgical exploration." The tamponades relieved, but there's structural damage to the right atrium. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. He didn't ask where she'd learned that technique. He didn't ask anything at all. The construction worker, the foreman's nephew, Laura would learn later, was crying silently, his massive frame shaking with the release of an impossible fear that had just transformed into something approaching hope. Nurses were already moving, running labs, preparing for transfer to the OR, establishing better for access. The controlled chaos had a different texture now. The crisis had moved from impossible to manageable in 90 seconds, and everyone in that room knew who'd made the difference. But Sterling was watching from the hallway, his face arranged in an expression of perfect calm. His eyes had gone the color of winter. He stood with his phone already in his hand, and Laura watched, in the careful way she'd learned to watch things over the years, as his jaw clenched and his thumb began moving across the screen with purpose. The phone call started before 6 p.m. She didn't hear them, but she felt them, the way the temperature of the hospital began to shift, subtle as a change in pressure. A board member named Harrison, someone Sterling had money with, someone with stakes in the hospital's credentialing process. A second board member named Reeves, who'd been caught in Sterling's insurance fraud web 3 years ago and was now grateful for the silence he'd purchased. A private investigator in Jacksonville with a reputation for turning over stones that the rest of the world was content to leave unexamined. By 7 p.m., Sterling had filed a 12-page complaint detailing the unauthorized pericardiocentesis, citing it as practicing beyond nursing scope, performing procedures that required physician oversight, and demonstrating dangerous independence in a critical care environment. Professional negligence. Recklessness. The language was careful and crafted to make what Laura had done, what had saved Jake Mercer's life, sound like a crime against medicine itself. He'd thought about how to weaponize her competence, and he'd found the perfect blade. The summons came at 6 a.m. the next morning. Patricia Ng, the hospital administrator, needed to see her in her office. Laura already knew what was coming. She'd seen the machinery before, not in hospitals, but in the military, where the removal of inconvenient people followed a script as predictable as a hymn. She walked into Ng's office and found Sterling standing beside her, his expression the kind of calm that only comes from believing you've already won. "Your badge is being deactivated, effective immediately," Ng said. She looked uncomfortable, the way civilians looked when they had to enforce someone else's will. "You're suspended pending investigation into the procedures you performed yesterday. You don't have access to the hospital until the review is complete." Laura set her badge on the desk. She said nothing. There was nothing to say to people who couldn't see what they were looking at. Security guard Marcus Webb, the same one who'd handed her initial orientation materials 8 months ago, was assigned to escort her to her locker. His face was apologetic in a way that made Laura want to tell him it wasn't his job to be apologetic for the world. She opened her locker, the small grey cube that had contained the 4 scrubs she rotated through, her second pair of shoes, a granola bar, and nothing else, and started placing items into a cardboard box Marcus had produced. 8 months. That's what 8 months of deliberately living as small as possible fit into. Her phone buzzed as she was closing the locker. A text from a number she recognized from her intake paperwork, the Savannah VA Hospital, confirming an appointment for 2 p.m. Her PTSD sessions. She almost laughed. The universe had a sense of timing. She didn't look back as Marcus walked her toward the exit. Sterling was still somewhere in the hospital, probably already making decisions about how to reshape the narrative around yesterday's procedure. She'd known his type before, the men who understood that if you could rewrite the story fast enough, the truth became just another competing opinion. The parking lot was bright and too warm, the humidity already climbing toward the suffocating pressure of a Savannah afternoon. Laura sat in her car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that was deliberately forgettable, and stared at the VA hospital address on her phone. Inside that building were people like her. People who'd seen things that had carved out pieces of their souls. People who'd learned to carry weight that wouldn't kill them because the alternative was dropping it, and what would happen then was worse. She'd been running long enough. From the moment she'd handed in her resignation letter 9 months ago, from the moment she'd decided that anonymous was the same as alive, she'd been operating on the principle that distance was safety. That if nobody knew her name, nobody could ask her to be something she'd trained herself not to be anymore. But Jake Mercer knew. Jake Mercer had felt the specific way her hands worked and recognized the signature of her training written in muscle memory. And Dr. Sterling knew, not the truth, not yet, but enough to understand that Laura Bennett was something more dangerous than a conscientious nurse. Something was about to break open. She could feel it the way soldiers felt atmospheric pressure changes before a storm. The administrator's office smelled like burnt coffee and old leather, the kind of space where bad news arrived punctually at 6 a.m. Patricia Ng sat behind mahogany with her hands folded, her expression the careful neutrality of someone who'd already made her decision before Laura walked through the door. The sunrise hadn't touched Savannah yet. The city was still sleeping, and Laura was about to fall out of her own life. "Sit," Ing said, and Laura sat. The chair felt like a dock where ships go to die. "Dr. Sterling filed a formal complaint last evening," Ing began, her voice moving like a piston, steady, relentless, efficient. 12 pages. 3 board member signatures. His alleging unauthorized medical procedures, practicing beyond nursing scope, and endangering patient safety during the mass casualty incident yesterday. Laura didn't move. The fluorescent overhead light buzzed, one continuous hum that sounded like a warning siren turned down to background noise. "The needle decompression you performed on the cardiac tamponade patient," Ing continued, opening a folder with Sterling's complaint inside. "Needle thoracostomy is a physician procedure. Sterling documented that you used a 14-gauge angiocath at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, without explicit physician authorization. He has statements from 2 residents confirming your actions." The words landed like ordnance. Laura had trained for worse: mortar rounds, incoming IED strikes, watching a 19-year-old Marine go septic in a field hospital because the blood bank was 15 kilometers away. This was different. This was institutional. This was Sterling's scalpel turning the emergency that saved a man's life into evidence of her crimes. "Your suspension is effective immediately," Ing said. She slid a letter across the desk, the corners sharp enough to cut. "Pending investigation by hospital legal, state nursing board review, and potential criminal referral. You're not to enter Sacred Heart facilities, access patient records, or contact staff until cleared." Laura read the words without reading them. The letters assembled themselves into a pattern her brain recognized: terminated. Expelled. Marked. "Security is waiting to escort you to your locker," Ing said. The walk to the employee lockers took her through corridors she'd navigated for 8 months, past the trauma bay where she'd stood yesterday watching a man's blood pour into a chest cavity, past the medication dispensary where she'd restocked supplies while planning how to disappear completely, past the break room where Dr. Sterling had made his bet with the residents about when she'd quit. She'd beaten all his timelines. She'd made it 8 months as nobody. 8 months of being invisible had bought her time, and then it ran out. Marcus Webb was waiting at the lockers, holding a cardboard box with the careful respect of a man escorting a coffin. He didn't meet her eyes. The hospital security guards knew better than to make eye contact with people being removed. It made you complicit. It made it real. Laura opened her locker. The contents of a hidden life came out in handfuls: extra scrub pants, a water bottle with the VA hospital logo, compression socks, a phone charger, and at the bottom, the faded unit patch sewn inside a leather envelope that she kept stitched to the interior wall. Special operations medical insignia on weathered fabric, colors bleached by sun and time and deliberate forgetting. She pulled it free, felt the thread whisper as it gave way, and placed it in the box with everything else. Marcus closed the lid. The cardboard sealed. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She didn't respond. She couldn't. The words that belonged to the civilian version of Laura Bennett, apologies, explanations, please, lived in a completely different woman. The woman standing in the hospital corridor at 6:24 a.m. had been stripped back to something earlier, something harder, something that had learned how to compartmentalize suffering into neat surgical packs so she could keep working. That night, she sat in the waiting room of the Savannah VA hospital, holding the cardboard box in her lap like a baby. The waiting room was carpeted in industrial gray, lit by panels that made everyone look like they'd been dead for 3 days. Around her, veterans sat in the particular silence of people who'd seen too much: a man with a left leg ending at the knee, a woman with tremor in both hands, 2 young Marines in desert camouflage fresh off deployment, their eyes still tracking exits and angles like they were still in Helmand Province instead of Georgia. She'd been scheduled for her PTSD intake appointment at 7:15 p.m., the same slot she'd been cancelling for 6 months. Tonight she hadn't cancelled. Tonight she needed to be somewhere, and this was somewhere. A therapist named Dr. Hammond came through the double doors. Laura Bennett. She stood. The box came with her. Hammond's office was designed to be safe: soft lighting, no sharp corners, plants that looked real but probably weren't. "I see this is your first appointment with us. Tell me what brought you in today." Laura couldn't say it. Couldn't articulate that the only identity she'd ever been good at, Senior Chief Petty Officer Bennett, combat medic, keeper of lives, handler of shattered things, had been systematically dismantled by a man in a designer suit who saw her competence as a threat instead of a gift. She couldn't say that she'd been running for so long that she'd forgotten how to stand still, and that standing still was the one thing that was supposed to keep her safe. "I saved someone's life yesterday," Laura said instead. "And it cost me everything." Hammond wrote something on a notepad. "Tell me about that." So Laura did. She talked about the construction foreman with the steering column through his chest, about the wild-eyed giant carrying him through the ER doors, about how the rooms had emptied and she'd walked toward it anyway because walking toward crisis was the only language her nervous system spoke. She talked about the needle decompression, the specific angle, the way she'd known exactly how long he had before his heart stopped permanently. She talked about saving him in 90 seconds. "And now?" Hammond asked gently. "Now I'm unemployed. Now there's a complaint. Now I'm suspended pending investigation. Now I'm sitting in a VA hospital waiting room with my entire career in a cardboard box, wondering if I should have just let the man die so I could keep pretending I was nobody." The silence in Hammond's office was the opposite of the hospital silence. This one was heavy with permission. Permission to feel something other than composure, permission to acknowledge that Laura Bennett had broken her own rules by saving someone and that saving people wasn't supposed to cost you this much. "I was good at two things," Laura whispered. "Medicine and silence. I was supposed to be able to do both. I wasn't supposed to need anyone to know." Across the city, Dr. Sterling sat in his townhouse on Victory Drive, nursing a scotch that cost $300 a bottle and tasted like vindication. The complaint was filed. The board members had signed. The private investigator had found nothing in her employment history before 8 months ago, which meant either she was clean or extremely good at hiding. He decided it didn't matter. Whether she was a threat or not, she was gone. He'd won. He'd systematized her removal like it was one of his phantom billing procedures, precise, deliberate, deniable. The insurance fraud was safe. His pattern of high-end procedures never performed, his $200,000 annual theft wrapped in hospital bureaucracy would stay hidden because the one person who noticed patterns was no longer in the building. Sterling poured another glass. Outside his window, Savannah slept. Somewhere in the city, Laura Bennett was sitting in a VA hospital waiting room, and he would never know that she was the reason his entire criminal enterprise was about to collapse. He would never know that Army Ranger Jake Mercer, the man she'd saved on the IR-95 pile-up, was fully conscious now and remembering exactly what a combat medic looked like in action. He would never know that the paralegal girlfriend of one of the board members had access to billing records, or that the state medical board investigator assigned to his case happened to be the sister of a Marine who'd served in Marja, or that the faded unit patch in Laura's cardboard box was about to become the most dangerous piece of evidence ever entered into hospital legal proceedings. But that wasn't Laura's problem anymore. That was tomorrow's problem, or next week's, or some version of the future that felt impossible to reach from where she sat in the waiting room, holding a box containing everything she'd tried to leave behind. She had no idea that Jake Mercer was asking the nurse station for her name at that exact moment. She had no idea that his daughter Sarah was already pulling billing records. She had no idea that her composure, the signature ability that had made her invisible, was about to become the shield that would protect her while everything around Sterling burned. For now, she was just a woman who'd forgotten how to stand still, sitting in a waiting room full of veterans who understood exactly what that meant. And in the particular mercy of that moment, nobody needed her to be anything except honest about how broken she felt. The rain started before midnight, hammering the parking lot like applause for something she couldn't see coming. Like and subscribe if you believe nurses deserve more respect. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in her shoes? I'm pinning the best answer.